All right, we are going to get started. It is 11:10. Welcome to day 2 of Practical Farmers Virtual Annual Conference and to this session titled Carbon on the Farm. I'm Megan Filbert, and I'll be moderating this session for our featured speakers, Jasmine Dillon and Dave Schmidt. Before we get started, a few bits of housekeeping. We'll be here for 1 hour together, and then have a long afternoon break before our evening features start again. So we have a virtual potluck tonight and our keynote speaker, Sarah Smarsh. That all starts around 6 o'clock. During our presentation today, please use the chat box in Zoom, the chat that I said, enter questions here. So I just sent a message in that. I'll be keeping an eye on that chat and relaying questions to our speakers throughout the presentation. Remember that this is a farmer to farmer dialogue. Really, it's a farmer to researcher dialogue. Dave Schmidt will be asking a series of questions to Jasmine Dillon after Jasmine's introductory presentation. Another note is that PFI is committed to civility. Be mindful that we're a diverse group representing many perspectives and that we are communicating in this new, unique virtual space. Please be courteous with your questions, respectful with your comments, and uphold PFI's core value of providing a welcoming space for everyone to learn and share about farming and agriculture. This session offers 1 continuing education unit credit. If you are a CCA, please scan the QR code. We recognize that we're having some trouble with these. You're only able to enter 1 per day. If you're having that issue, please email info@practicalfarmers.org with your name, CCA number, and sessions you attended, and we'll get them submitted for you. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jasmine. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I'm here in Colorado, so we're approaching afternoon. Thank you all for joining our session. I wanted to start us off with kind of a short presentation just to give some background on carbon cycles on the farm and a little bit of the work that I do, and then open up for Dave and I to have some dialogue and to answer some of your questions. My name is Dr. Jasmine Dillon. I'm an assistant professor of beef and dairy agroecosystems at Colorado State University. And disclaimer in the beginning, I'm trained as an animal scientist, an engineer, a soil scientist, and a systems analyst and modeling person, which means that I know enough in these subjects to be dangerous. So jack of all trades, master of none, but that is where my strength lies. So I'll do my best to answer all of your questions, but if there are things I need to follow up with afterwards, please don't hesitate to reach out maybe to Megan or to me through my email. And we can discuss more and get specific numbers on things and specific recommendations as needed. So without further ado, let's talk a bit about carbon cycles on the farm. So many of you, this isn't anything new to you. You all are managing this system every day. And so what I wanted to do is just kind of briefly overview the carbon cycle on farms, just to get us thinking about carbon and refreshed on things that we may not think about every day. So plants absorb energy from the sun. There's that solar energy we rely upon. And as they absorb that energy in the sun, they break down water from the soil into hydrogen and oxygen, and some of that oxygen gets released back into the atmosphere. At the same time, those plants are pulling carbon dioxide in from the air, making sugars and growing themselves as a plant. They're also growing roots, which is what you see down here below the soil. And those roots support a very diverse ecosystem below ground that, as many of you know, influences what we see happening above ground. They feed microbes, they feed insects and things that make the soil their home, and they contribute significantly to the formation of organic matter in the soil. Those plants are also grazed and trampled by livestock, who then return the favor by naturally fertilizing the land with their manure patties. And that manure patty gets incorporated into the soil to add more carbon to it. The plants and the animal release some of that carbon back into the atmosphere through CO2 and methane, and the cycle starts again. And so this is the carbon cycle that we're managing as grazers, as crop producers, This is one of the major cycles that we're managing with all our management decisions. Let's talk a little bit more about soil carbon. So I mentioned as we go through this process, as plants grow, they're constantly building their root system below ground. The more mature the plant is allowed to get, the more roots that they're going to put down below ground. Those roots not only feed microbes, but they also die off. And all of this contributes to soil organic matter where soil carbon resides. Many people, for a long time, we've talked about soil organic matter as kind of a monolith. There's this thing called soil organic matter, and we want more of it, and more of it is better. And more of it means that we're potentially mitigating some of the impacts of climate change. But something that we're starting to learn as we start to study soil organic matter and soil organic matter dynamics is that there are actually two different pools of organic matter. One of them we call POM, or particulate organic matter. One way to think about this is vulnerable. This is organic matter that's actually vulnerable to being released back into the atmosphere. So about 0 to 5%, anywhere from 0 to 5% of the organic matter in a soil is vulnerable. Much of what makes up the vulnerable fraction comes from the litter that falls from the plants, from the trampling of the forages by animals, and some of the cycling that happens in the first 0 to 2 inches of the soil. So if you're measuring at those depths, this is the part of the soil that you're going to see pretty dramatic increases in the short term, particularly if you're going from somewhat degraded land and using practices that improve soil health. Another way to think about the vulnerable fraction of soil organic matter is thinking about it as the checking account. So you're making deposits and you're spending them. About 0 to 10% of that soil organic matter fraction is what we call MOM, or mineral associated organic matter. This is a more protected form of organic matter, and it takes a longer time to form, but it also stays in the soil for a longer period of time. And I've got some more details about each of these on the next page. But a way that you can think about MOM, or the protected fraction of the soil, is as the savings account. So when you make deposits in the MOM, that's really where you're sequestering carbon in your soil for long periods of time. Now, the ability for any given soil to store more carbon in the checking account versus the savings account is partially related to previous management. It's related to your local climate, so the amount of rainfall you get, and it's also related to the amount of clay in your soils. So let's look at this a little bit more closely. Here's a diagram that's just showing some of the differences in characteristics of each of the types of soil carbon. So of course, you've got the plant above ground, growing roots below ground. As those roots and any decaying animals and insects break down, they start to form organic matter, which is represented by both of these piles. On the left side, you see particulate organic matter. And if you look at the little microscopic snapshot, these particles are pretty big if you compare them to the snapshot on the right side. So these are the larger fractions of decaying organic matter in the soil. This vulnerable fraction, this POM, has a lifetime of about 1 to 50 years in the soil. It's fast cycling, meaning that once you put it in the soil, it's going to get burned up faster by microbes and plants than the protected fraction would. And the composition of this organic matter has more carbon than nitrogen in it. Let's see if I can. There we go. On the right side of the screen, you see the protected, or the MOM organic matter. If you look at the microscopic view of MOM, you see that the particles are a lot smaller. And in this type of organic matter, you have more minerals. It's these minerals that allow the carbon to be bound in the soil. And because of that binding, the lifetime of the MOM fraction of organic matter, the protected fraction, is anywhere from 10 to 1,000 years. So that carbon stays in the soil for a much longer time. It's much slower cycling. It's not as readily available. And it's got a higher nitrogen, higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than the POM. And that's partly a reflection of the fact that the development of the protected fraction is reliant upon soil microbes. And just like us, those soil microbes have to be fed not just carbon, but also nitrogen. Is everyone tracking with me here? Am I talking too fast? Can I get a thumbs up? All right, so let's keep going. So one of the things that we often hear about as we talk about changing climates worldwide is that sequestering carbon in soils has the potential to mitigate some of the impacts of increasing carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. There's a group of scientists that did some work on this, asking the question, how much can natural climate solutions being practices which increase the amount of organic matter in the soil and therefore the soil carbon in the soil, how much can these natural climate solutions contribute to mitigating climate change? And what these scientists found is that across the suite of natural climate solutions, so that includes not only managed grazing, but also the use of cover cropping, no-till in certain circumstances, the reforestation of some lands, the use of silvopastoral systems, et cetera, this suite of practices, we may be able to offset the equivalent of about 21% of current net US emissions. So a pretty sizable portion, not to be neglected. That said, this is a hotly debated topic. And there, if you go online and look for this, you can see groups of scientists arguing back and forth with valid arguments on both sides about whether or not this is possible. A lot of the debate is centered around the fact that it requires people to adopt these practices across large swaths of land in order for them to be effective. I'll stick there unless y'all have more questions later about this. So zooming further out from this picture of soil carbon dynamics and their ability to mitigate climate change, it's probably important to know, how much does agriculture even contribute to greenhouse gas emissions? So agriculture in the United States contributes about 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And this is largely because we have such large energy sectors. So we use a lot of electricity and we burn a lot of fossil fuels. So those are the major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions in the US. If we were living in a country where we did not drive as many vehicles or didn't drive as far, then agriculture would make up a larger percent, maybe up to 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And something many of you have probably heard about is that the issue with climate change and greenhouse gas emissions is all those cows and their farts. And what I want to say first is that methane comes out of the cow's mouth, not the cow's butt. There's no farting going on. Well, there's a little bit, but not much. About 95% of the methane that comes out of the cow comes out of her mouth. And what is important to know is that methane production from cows is a byproduct of digestion. So when a cow eats any feed, she swallows it, she chews it up, she swallows it, it goes into the rumen for further fermentation by microbes. As those carbons get broken down, they break off hydrogens, and those hydrogens sit in rumen fluid. The bacteria that go through the process of breaking down food, hydrogen is actually toxic to them. So the way that they detoxify their environment so that they can live is they capture those hydrogens and they make methane, which turns into a gas in the rumen. If the cow then belches it out, because if she doesn't, she would explode. And so methane does get produced, but it is a natural byproduct of digestion. And there are a couple of important things to know about that. One of them is that the carbon that the cow is digesting is part of that natural biogenic cycle. This isn't new carbon being put into the atmosphere, such as would be the case of if we were burning fossil fuels, we'd be taking carbon from trapped sources, burning it and putting it into the atmosphere to continue cycling. In the case of the cow is just consuming a plant that has already consumed carbon from the atmosphere. She's breaking it down and releasing it back to the atmosphere for later uptake. The other important thing to know is that fermentation of forages does produce more methane than fermentation of grains, and that's just related to digestibility and the types of microbes that each of those feeds supports in the rumen. But there's more to the story about methane. So methane actually has a larger short-term impact on climate, but a smaller long-term impact on climate than carbon dioxide. So there are three primary greenhouse gases that we're concerned with: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And what you'll often hear is that methane has 25 times the warming potential, or the ability to trap heat or energy in Earth's energy balance, than carbon dioxide. You'll also hear that nitrous oxide has 298 times the ability to trap that energy than carbon dioxide has. Something important to know, though, is that that's when you're thinking about the impact of these gases on energy balance in a 100-year time span. If we were to go out to 500 years, the impact, the ability of methane to trap that energy decreases from 25 to 7.6 times the potency of carbon dioxide. Similarly, the nitrous oxide, the ability of nitrous oxide to capture or trap that energy reduces from 298 to 153 times the potency of carbon dioxide. And that's because each of these gases has a different lifetime in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide that's emitted today, let's say, well, we're all virtual. So maybe in the production of electricity that we're using in our houses. But if we'd flown to the conference or driven to the conference, the carbon dioxide that was emitted out of our tailpipes will be around for the rest of our lives, our children's lives, our grandchildren's lives, their children's lives, and even maybe longer. So 500 years plus. Methane emitted today is only in the atmosphere for about 12 years before it gets broken down to other compounds. Nitrous oxide that's emitted today is only in the atmosphere for about 114 years for what's emitted today. And this has important implications for the actual climate impact of each of these greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural systems. So what we find is that for systems that have greater fossil fuel use, they actually have a greater long-term impact than systems that use fewer fossil fuels. So I'm going to show you some data from a study that was published in 2015, where they looked at the climate impacts of a bunch of different beef systems. But I'm only going to show grain finishing systems and grass-fed systems. And first I'll compare grain finishing with grass-fed systems, and then I'll compare two different types of grass-fed systems. The feedlot-based system is a Midwestern system, pretty typical. Calves are raised on a cow-calf operation. They're weaned. They may go into a stocker operation. They might go straight into a feedlot. They spend several months on concentrate diets in the feedlot, and then they're processed for beef. That animal might be ready for consumption by about 18 months of age. Compare this with, in the paper, a low input grass-fed beef system. So this grass-fed beef system was one in Brazil. So a very low input system, not much use of four-wheelers or pickups, and using a lot more acres of land, but with much less input and maybe harvesting an animal at 3 years of age. And one thing I want to acknowledge is that there are a lot of trade-offs in this, and I hope we'll get into some discussion of the trade-offs during the question and answers. That's the fun stuff to me. But so what I'm going to show you is the long-term climate impact of both of these systems. So first, this black line on both graphs represents the total warming due to all greenhouse gases emitted by each system. The second line, in this case, it's a green line, represents, and I'm following it with a laser pointer for those of you to follow. This is the warming due to methane for each system. The blue line represents the warming due to nitrous oxide over time for each system. And the red line represents the warming due to carbon dioxide over time. You look at the x-axis, you see that each graph is going from 0 years to 1,000 years. And on the y-axis, each graph is going from 0 kelvins of warming to 1.2 Kelvin warming. If we were to think just about global warming potentials, where we're only thinking about the impacts of each of the gases on climate in 100 years, you'll see that in the grand scheme of things, the grain-based system and the grass-fed system are pretty similar. But if I were to draw a straight line, which I don't know if I can do right now because my hands are shaking, the grain finished system would have a slightly lower warming effect than the grass-fed system. However, if we were to think about a little bit longer time span, so if we said, well, 100 years isn't very long, and we want to know what is the long-term impact of these systems on climate, and what should I be prioritizing if thinking about the food systems and the climates of generations to come, then you would trace out this black line over the 1,000 years. And what you see is that while the grain finished system had a lower impact at 100 years, the effects of warming for this system continue to climb for the full 1,000-year time period that was explored. The grass-fed system does continue to increase, but it starts to plateau. And if you look a little closer, you'll see that each of these black lines is following the trend of the carbon dioxide line. So if you You can see that the carbon dioxide lines increasing pretty linearly for the feedlot system or the grain finishing system. And the carbon dioxide line for the grass-fed system is increasing, but at a much slower rate over time. And you see that the impact is slowing, the rate of increase of the impact is slowing down over time. So this change in the impact on climate is a direct reflection of the fossil fuels used, not the methane emitted by each of the animals. In this paper, they also considered two different types of grass-fed systems. So they compared a higher input grass-fed system where you might be driving tractors, putting up hay, because maybe you live in an area kind of like the Midwest where there might be parts of the year where you're covered in snow, you're not able to graze. And so you've got to store some forage to feed those animals. They compared that system with a low input grass-fed system, like the one in Brazil, where there may not be as much need to store feed because of the climate there, et cetera. And so out to 100 years for these systems, the warming impact was about the same. And just to refresh everyone, the x-axis on this graph is the same as the previous one. We're going 0 to 1,000 years. And then the y-axis is the same as the previous one, going from 0 Kelvin of warming to 1.4 Kelvin. So out to 100 years, each grass-fed system has about the same impact. But if you look out over time, you'll see that once again, there's a divergence with the system that's a little bit higher, or that's higher input, having a greater warming impact over time than the low input system. And in this graph, they don't have carbon dioxide on it, but you'll see it in the paper. This is a direct reflection of carbon dioxide emissions by this system. So when we're thinking about climate impacts, and we're thinking about agriculture, so not just beef systems, but when we're thinking about cropping systems, something key to focus on is what is our reliance on fossil fuels, which is basically a source of new carbon in the atmosphere. So I didn't want to talk too much because I could keep talking about this. Normally I talk about this stuff in an hour-long or hour-and-a-half-long presentation, and I want to give Dave an opportunity to ask questions and other folks. So what I want to kind of highlight real quick to jump us into our discussion is a few of the main points that I showed in the presentation. The first is the one that I just harped on, that reducing fossil fuel use is key to reducing long-term climate impacts. So we see a lot of focus on methane and livestock and agriculture in the media, and it's because we're thinking about the immediacy of the desire to limit average global temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. And so people are thinking only in a short-term window. And if you're thinking in a short-term window, you're going to say, well, we need to cut methane and nitrous oxide emissions. But if you're thinking a little bit longer term than 100 years, reducing fossil fuel use, which is a source of new carbon, is key to ensuring that we reduce our long-term climate impact. Something I didn't quite articulate when I showed you all the picture of the plant growing, I mentioned that roots growing into the soil and then dying off is a major contributor to organic matter and therefore soil carbon formation in the soil. This means that the more you can incorporate perennials, the more that you can incorporate living roots into your soil, the more carbon that you're putting away into that soil. Now, something that's important to know is that not only are we putting more carbon into that soil, some of it's going into the vulnerable fraction and some of it's going into the protected fraction. And this is an area where the science is new. We haven't, the potential of each soil to store vulnerable organic matter versus protected organic matter differs by region and by soil type. But as we begin to learn what management practices work in different areas to store more protected carbon, that information will begin to become more and more populated. I know we've got initiatives at Colorado State, and there are others in other places to start incorporating these types of analyses into soil health tests so that we can learn more about how these things change with management practices across places. The important thing to remember as we think about these two different fractions and trying to store carbon in each of them is that the most important thing that you can do on your individual operation is to establish a baseline for your particular operation. And the idea would be that you would have information at multiple depths, because sometimes you can store more carbon in the shallow portion of the soil, but lose some at the deeper portions of the soil. And so if you can get soil tests run, let's say in the 0 to 2 inches fraction, and then in the 2 to 6 inches fraction, it's going to tell you a lot more about what's happening in your full soil profile than just getting one, let's say, in the 0 to 2 inch, at the 0 to 2 inch depth. And one of the things I always like to bring up whenever we're talking about soil carbon and organic matter is that irrespective of whether or not increasing carbon sequestration mitigates climate, there are a host of other ecosystem benefits, ecosystem service benefits that come along with more organic matter. So you get better water infiltration, better nutrient cycling, more minerals unlocked in the soils through microbial activity, wildlife habitat. There are all kinds of ecosystem service benefits that come along with increasing your organic matter. So however the arguments shake out about carbon sequestration and climate, it's really important to know that you are providing all these other ecosystem service benefits by managing for this aspect of soils, and that's not to be taken lightly. So with that, I want to stop sharing my screen and let us open up for questions, which I see there are some things going on in the chat.
Yeah, Jasmine, I'll relay those to you.
Okay.
And let's do those clarifying questions before we have Dave start asking questions.
Okay, sounds good.
So, okay, so Alice McGarry, is this assuming that we are continuing to add new gases as we continue to raise more cows, or are you doing calculations as if gases are just breaking down and not being added?
So are you thinking about the long-term climate impact? Is that what that question was coming from? If you're thinking about, so the question is, let's make sure I got it right. Are we making these analyses for the long-term climate impact based on continuing to add new carbon? The numbers in the graph, yeah. So in that particular analysis, they were considering if emissions continue the way that they are today, then those emissions that happen today would have that impact on warming over time. Does that answer the question? Megan, do you think I should further clarify that?
Alice is welcome to unmute, but we do have to just keep moving here. Okay. Tom Wind asked, does the global warming for the two systems consider the potential to store more carbon in the soil? So sequestration.
Yeah, so and I I meant to actually double check that in the analysis. As I remember it, I don't think that they assumed carbon sequestration in that figure, but in the paper they do discuss the impacts of carbon sequestration. In terms of how the results would change with carbon sequestration, if you assume that more carbon sequestration is happening in the grass-fed systems for that grain finish versus grass finish system, then the grain finish system would still have a higher climate impact because it's still going to be more reliant on fossil fuels. So still that new source of carbon. If you're thinking about it in terms of the two grass finish systems, whichever system is more reliant on carbon dioxide is likely still going to have a higher impact. But what would really change that would depend on how much carbon you're actually able to store in your soil and how that compares to the carbon that's being used or emitted back into the atmosphere through the use of pickups, four-wheelers, et cetera.
And one more question before we move to Dave. I'm combining two comments. So someone asked, why not sample deeper than 6 inches? And someone said, research data shows that we need to sample 4 feet plus deep to accurately measure carbon accumulation in the soil.
Thank you, yeah, for those comments. So thank you for those comments. Yeah, the data that I'm pulling come from looking at differences between systems and how that carbon changed over time. The deeper you go into the soil profile, the more you're going to understand about what's happening in both the shallow profile, the shallow parts of the soil and deep parts of the soil.
So Dave, let's move on to your questions for Jasmine.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. This is in line with the last question that you were just talking to. It's related to the checking account versus the savings account, your POM and MOM soil fractions. We've typically done 0 to 6 inch sampling. We have in the past once done 6 to 12 inch soil sampling. And we quit doing the 6 to 12 just because it's harder and more money. Do you feel like the 0 to 6 inch results only show that what's in the checking account, or are we getting into some of the more long-term protected carbon? And is it worth doing 6 to 12 inch regularly? We try to do it every 2 to 3 years.
I think so. It's going to depend a little bit on the system that you're working with. If you're working with a long-term perennial system, you're probably going to want more information to deeper depths. But the more shallow you go, the more that you're going to be understanding the amount of palm that's being sequestered. That said, you're still going to get information about how the mom or the protected fraction is changing at those depths. The important thing would be to, at some interval, sample deeper, because you want to know what's happening deeper in the soil profile as I'm accumulating organic matter here. Are we burning up what's down below? And so, based on my understanding of the and what we know about the protected versus vulnerable carbon right now, every few years sampling, especially because organic matter is sequestered in those parts of the soil profile more slowly, which should give you some picture of what's happening in the long term deeper into the soil profile.
Okay. So if we've seen soil carbon increase from the lab results by a couple percent, or maybe 1.5%, since we started probably 8 years ago, that's probably purely the palm fraction.
I wouldn't say it's purely palm. I think, and this is where being able to actually run this analysis is important. And so I think as this becomes more and more mainstream, I know that there are the soil scientists here in our group. We've got a pretty powerful soil carbon group here at Colorado State. Many of them are advocating for using this separation in all soil health tests. Because we don't know, and it's going to vary by previous management, it's going to vary by current management, and then location and the specific type of soil that you're sampling.
Okay. We try to do pretty intensive grazing management, so we move the cows at least once a day, often 2 to 3, sometimes even more times per day. So they're on an area, they impact it heavily, they graze it, and then they trample what they don't graze, and the rest of it rests for sometimes 2 or 3 months. Is there a way to quantify the potential carbon sequestration benefits of that versus, say, more continuous grazing?
Yeah, so of course, in the beginning, the more you can get actual samples across the landscape, the better. But when you're thinking about it just from a kind of soil carbon dynamics perspective or soil organic matter dynamics perspective, there is going to be sequestration in that shallow part of the soil profile from what's being trampled, what's falling off of the plant, et cetera. And then the resultant stimulation to the microbial activity in that part of the soil profile. But the more rest that you can give the plants and the more living roots you have in the soil, the deeper those roots are going to penetrate to stimulate organic matter production in the deeper parts of the soil profile. And so whether you're moving once a day or 4 times a day, or going clockwise or counterclockwise, the more time that plant gets to rest, the greater opportunity there is to foster the growth of the microbial community, the greater opportunity to put roots down into the deeper parts of the soil profile. And what's important about that is that the protected part of that organic matter is majorly mediated by that microbial activity. So the more rest, the more time the soil is able to do its magic, theoretically, the more that you should get organic matter accumulation.
Okay, thanks. Another question related to grazing management too. Most of our pastures are cool season perennials, common in Midwestern grazing systems, orchard grass, smooth brome. We've also got some areas that we graze where it's native warm season prairie, tallgrass prairie species, much deeper rooted species. They're almost all warm seasons. Do you feel like a long rest period is beneficial in both those systems? And is there a maximum? If we would graze something really hard, let it rest for an entire year, is that more beneficial than saying grazing it only 2 or 3 times a year? Like in an extreme case of really long rest.
Yeah, and so this is the area where I'm going to give you kind of a general understanding of the trends, but if you want really specific rates and that kind of thing, then I can pull those numbers from you from some of the folks I know who work specifically with these soil fractions. So your question is, is grazing it really hard and resting it longer better than grazing it more frequently, right? In terms of soil organic matter formation. I do think that that's going to vary by the plant type and the previous management and the type of soil that plant is growing in. Thinking about it from a root development perspective, if in the hit it hard system where you hit it once and let it rest longer, that plant is getting more time to develop below ground, and the plant is getting more time to foster the microbial community that makes organic matter formation possible, theoretically you would accumulate more carbon. Now, how that would look over time, is the difference meaningful? I'm not sure. That's the bigger question to ask. Is the difference really meaningful? And would some combination of the two be ideal? Probably.
Okay,
So
great, thanks.
yeah.
And then a question, this is more related to marketing and kind of our business as we direct market to customers. If consumers hear more and more that livestock production is bad for the climate and grass-fed beef production is more carbon intensive than, say, a grain-fed system where they're finished faster and harvested quicker, how do we tell this story to our customers without trying to explain the entire cycle, and getting into the methane versus the longevity of methane versus carbon dioxide? Is there a really short take home that we can tell somebody and say, hey, we think we're sequestering carbon versus actually emitting carbon with our livestock?
Yeah, so that's a tough one. How do you boil down nuance to kind of a quick statement? So I think one of the things that sometimes is eye-opening for folks, and I'm going to give a couple of ideas. One of them is a little bit more creative, and one of them is like if you just want to have a quick point to share or start a dialogue. One of the things I think that people often don't think about is this idea of new carbon. Is it really new carbon? No, but it's new carbon cycling in the atmosphere for what we know to be normal. Okay, so we've become accustomed to a certain climate, certain weather patterns, et cetera, over long periods of time. And that's based on a certain energy balance on Earth. That carbon that's been trapped down in rock has not been cycling as part of the carbon cycle on Earth. And so in some ways, liberating that by drilling creates a new carbon source to begin cycling. And so one of the ways I think to start to get people thinking is to say, and this might be weird because I haven't heard the term new carbon, but fossil fuels are new carbon. We're cycling old carbon. Now, if you're using tractors and things like that, you are using, some fossil fuels, but you're dependent on that, right? There are some things that you're dependent on. We live in a global society that is driven by the use of fossil fuels currently. But what you could say is, you're cycling old carbon and trying to minimize the addition of new carbon to the atmosphere. Sometimes that surprises people. Sometimes you can explain, plants take up carbon, right? And they remember that. Animals eat the plants. Animals produce methane and they put that carbon back in the atmosphere, and it's a cycle. That could be a one-off. And then sometimes I think, some people learn by seeing and feeling. And so I almost wonder if, I remember when I was studying this topic, I would go visit farms. And this is when I knew the differences about the carbon footprints, but I was trying to reconcile the information in my mind. And I would say, the carbon footprint can't be the only measure of environmental impact, because I go visit farms that might have a higher carbon footprint, but the place is teeming with life. There are animals everywhere, there are insects everywhere, there are protected species that weren't there before that now are there. The soil is alive. If I dig a hole, there's earthworms and things in it. And there's got to be something more to this than the carbon footprint. The thing that brought that to my attention was actually getting out in the field. And so you can't take all your customers out to the field, but you can bring a soil sample to the farmer's market, right? And whether or not a consumer makes that connection between carbon and what you're showing, you can potentially make that connection for them. If you've got pictures in your marketing, you can show them, here's what it was before and here's what it is now. And you can show them the result, and that may have some impact. I'm not a marketing specialist, but those are my thoughts.
That's great. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Hey, Dave, let's hear one more question from you, and then we're going to go to the questions in the chat box.
Okay, that sounds good. Most of our soils are silty clay loam. Some of them are clay loam. Quite a bit of clay. Is that beneficial in terms of our ability to sequester carbon in the soil?
Yes. So you basically have a competitive advantage. The more clay that you have, the more ability you have for those carbon particles to attach to the minerals and then be stored in the protected form in the soil. So farms with lower percentage clay in their soils can also store protected carbon. But from what we know so far, clay is a key factor in storing more of the protected form of organic matter.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, Dave. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm gonna dive into the questions that have been coming in through the chat box. Firstly, we knew this was gonna come up from Ronald Lindblom. How are we doing with being able to join in carbon markets for sequestration when it's so hard to measure right now?
Great question. I know the question was going to come up, but I don't like talking about carbon markets. So they're a difficult thing to me. As a researcher, I don't like to pretend that I am the person with my bottom line, my family's groceries, my family's farm on the line. And so I never recommend someone bet their farm on a carbon market. Especially because there is so much uncertainty and difficulty in measuring actual carbon captured. If you have access to a market, if you have a financial advisor, which I am not, who can help you navigate that decision and the risk you may be taking on, I think that they are an opportunity for you to potentially get paid for some of your ecosystem services. But I think that's a decision, that has to be taken carefully. And I cannot stand up here and tell you to do it because it's not my food on the line, at least not immediately. So.
Thanks, Jasmine. Okay. Interesting question from Curtis here. If you take CO2 out of the equation due to sequestration, does that not then mean that feedlot-based feeding would cause less climate change?
So you mean if they emitted no carbon dioxide, would they cause less warming? Okay, so there's another factor in the equation, which is, we'll call it new nitrogen. It's not new nitrogen, but it's new reactive nitrogen. So there's lots of nitrogen in the atmosphere. A lot of it is inert. It's not reacting with anything. The soil may be taking some up, the soil may be taking some up, but it's not reacting with anything. If you're using synthetic fertilizers in the production of crops that get fed to animals that are in feedlots, let's say, you might still have a greater warming effect in the long term because you're still introducing new nitrogen to the system. And that nitrous oxide has 114 times the potency of carbon dioxide in the, I think that was the 500-year, that's the 500-year value. So there still would be some contribution to warming that would be lesser in a system that wasn't using synthetic fertilizer. Now, if somehow there were absolutely no synthetic fertilizers and no fossil fuel emissions happening in a grain finishing system, perhaps you would have less warming from that system. And I think actually this brings up a good point, which is that when we talk about sustainability, and I teach this in my class, there are several valid narratives for how you achieve sustainable food systems. And one of the things I always teach is that you can choose from one of many solutions. And one of the arguments is that, well, if consumption is going to continue increasing, then you need to incentivize let's say the most efficient system. And in that case, you might make a value judgment. You might say, okay, we're going to take a little bit more climate impact, but use more sort of organic matter forming cropping practices and somehow kind of marry the benefits from the two systems. But it's actually really messy. So I like the question. It's a very theoretical question. If we didn't have fossil fuels, the grain finishing system would look very different anyway. So it's hard to say just yes or no to that question. I think it's more of a fun thought exercise.
Yeah. Jasmine, what can we do as crop farmers? So this farmer grows forage and grain. What can we do in a short time frame to better utilize the carbon cycles to reduce fertilizer use and increase crop yields?
So in a short time frame, the question is, what can we do as crop farmers to better utilize? Sorry, can you say that again? Better utilize what again?
to better utilize the carbon cycle to help reduce fertilizer use and increase yields?
Okay, so the more you can build your organic matter, the more microbial activity you have, the more the ecosystem in the soil is unlocking that nitrogen and carbon for you. Now, some of the things that you can do are the things you hear about often: cover cropping, incorporation of perennials into your forage mixes. I know one of the things that, if any of you are familiar with Mad Agriculture, one of the things that I know that they work on up here is helping get croplands into rotations where there are portions of the land that spend multiple years in perennial production. And that portion of the land rotates. So maybe there's, 5 years in alfalfa, or 5 years in a mix of cool and warm season grasses. And then there may be some tillage of that land to go ahead and produce annual crops, because now you've done some feeding of the microbes in that portion of the land. And then the portion that had been previously annual cropped, even if it was with cover crops and other things, might go into a perennial mix. The idea is, one, to keep that living root in the soil, and then to keep it in the soil for as long as possible. And another thing too to think about, and this has to be done, of course, with soil tests and in consultation with your nutrient management plan. But when you use manure as a fertilizer, you're getting both carbon and nitrogen that you're putting into the soil. So you're helping foster the formation of organic matter, and potentially the more protected form of organic matter, because you've added the carbon and nitrogen together, as opposed to just using a synthetic fertilizer where you're introducing the nitrogen alone and possibly actually burning up some of that organic matter a bit faster. So does that answer that question, would you say?
Thanks, Jasmine. Yeah. So Alice McGarry just wants to build on what Dave asked earlier, which is, what is a more ideal window of longer time to leave plants to rest between grazings?
I'm thinking about an answer, because it depends. Everything depends. More ideal, basically depending on the plants that you're managing, you want them to have at some point in time an opportunity to mature. Because once that plant isn't using so much carbon to grow and become reproductive, it's going to put more carbon into the roots that it's growing in the soil. And so however much time you need to leave between grazings, because you all know your pastures, you can go look at your pastures and when it's time to graze something, and it's time to graze something because it's getting mature. If each parcel of land has over time the ability to become mature, then it's also going to have the ability to put down more roots to build that organic matter and feed those microbes that are in the soil supporting its growth. So I'm sorry that's not a 14 days or 21 days type of answer, but it's really that you're managing.
Jasmine, does the Haney soil test distinguish between POM and MOM?
That is a good question. I'm not sure, but I can double check on that, and I can follow up with Megan about it.
Do any soil tests distinguish?
Yes. Give me so I know that we do them here at CSU, but I don't know yet. We've got a soil, water, and plant lab that you can submit soil tests through, but we're also in the process of building kind of a center, and I believe that will be the default on our center. But if you want, you can visit, if you go to Colorado State Soil, Plant, Water Lab, you can call the lab and ask about soil testing, and then request, that organic matter gets split out that way.
Jasmine, how would silvopasture or like trees influence the different types of soil carbon?
So this is something kind of interesting. When you, in one of the early studies, kind of looking at these differences across different types of ecosystems, forests of all types store more of the vulnerable type of carbon. And this is both in temperate and my words are loose. I've hit my head one too many times in the last year.
Deciduous.
Deciduous, thank you. In all forest types, more of the vulnerable, or the POM, more of the organic matter is in the POM fraction, the vulnerable fraction. If you look at grasslands of all different types, more of the organic matter, and therefore the soil carbon, is in the protected form of organic matter.
Thanks, Jasmine. So we are just at time, and Jasmine, I'm just hoping, can you just very quickly sum up, like, what can farmers do to, to like increase carbon sequestration on their farms?
So more living roots, more rest, and monitor. So monitor what's changing, because you know what you changed in management over time. So monitor those pastures to figure out what worked and what didn't work, or those croplands to figure out what worked and didn't work. And ask wherever you do your soil health testing now, ask them about the split, because if they don't have it now, but you're asking for it, they're going to go find out about it and get it. So I'd say that's the next step.
And I was just reminded, we do have until 12:10. I'm very sorry. That's my mistake. We have 10 more minutes. So we have
Great.
more time for questions.
Excellent.
It's hard to keep track of it all. Dave, do you have any further questions for Jasmine?
Yeah, and this goes back to grazing management. We can't, well, we've got kind of a set forage mix. We're not likely to change that once it's established. What we can easily change is how we graze. And this is kind of related to a different question, but is there a theoretical maximum sequestration rate that we could achieve with perfect, I know there's no such thing as perfect grazing management, but is there there's got to be an upper limit. So if we did everything just right, do you have any idea what sort of sequestration rate we could achieve?
Yeah, so this is also something that's somewhat debated as well. Is there like a cap on the total storage, and is there a cap on the rate? So when it comes to sequestration rates, if you are maintaining the same carbon inputs every year and managing the exact same way every year, ultimately, likely you're going to reach some cap for total storage and rate. What has to change is something about the management scheme and something about the carbon inputs, because it has to come from somewhere, right? In terms of actual values, that's going to depend on previous management, current management, and the soil types that you're working with.
Okay.
Okay, Jasmine, a couple questions. So we have, okay, Tom Wind asked, if a longer rest period helps sequester more carbon deeper, would it make sense to have a shorter rest periods through the summer and then a longer rest period at the end of the grazing season to create stored forage for use during the winter?
I'm assuming then in this case it's shorter rest periods during the time the plant is growing faster. Is that kind of what the idea is? Okay, I see you nodding, Tom. So yes, because the plant is going to be achieving maturity faster, right, during those times of the growing season. So theoretically, you could rotate through those pastures more quickly than you could as they start to hit the summer slump, if you're grazing cool seasons anyway. But what I've also seen folks do is, and this has to be part of a grazing management plan, is just defer a piece of land and let it rest for a year. So not fallow, but you've got perennials in there, and you just don't graze that section or that paddock that year. And so each year you'd rotate which paddock it is that you allow to really just get a full rest. It's like a vacation, I guess you could say. Let it take vacation, and then just you could move around your place, or maybe you recognize as you start doing this that there are some paddocks that need a little more help than others, and so maybe you decide, okay, this area of the land, I'm going to give that piece a little bit longer rest, or put it back into the rest rotation more frequently. So yeah.
Jasmine, you'll like this question. So this is regarding, Dave had asked about how to use this as a marketing tool.
Yeah.
And Michael Snow is asking, is there a good index for what we're trying to do, like life cycle assessment or emergy analysis or something more comprehensive?
Yes. So actually, Dave volunteered I teach a sustainable animal systems course. And I really want the students to get some hands-on with this, because when it comes to these types of analyses and things, you have to think about it. And the only way you really think about it is if you have to analyze someone's system. And so Dave had asked this marketing question before, and I volunteered my class to do a life cycle assessment of his farm. So we are going to do a life cycle assessment for his operation. And this is something I intend to continue doing. So life cycle assessments, what they let you do is just take stock of all of the inputs to your farm, all of the impacts of those inputs on your farm, and the impacts incurred in the production of the inputs to the farm. And what we can do is you can look at, okay, what's the overall carbon emission, let's say, and if you've got data on carbon sequestration, we can use that to adjust the carbon footprint. And then we can identify, okay, where are the hot spots for use? Once you recognize the hot spots for use, okay, what are some feasible solutions for reducing that? And what I'm hoping we can do initially, so if you want to sign up for this, I think my email is on the program. I can put it in the chat. You can email me and we can work with the class to actually do something like this for you. And then the idea would be to kind of monitor it over time. So actually, Aurora Organic Dairy is a big dairy that's out near here, and they do a life cycle assessment for their operation every year. So they kind of set targets, they evaluated where they were, and then every year they do a new assessment to look at how they're making progress towards their goals.
Jasmine, we were reminded in the chat by Diane Mayerfeld that this was about silvopasture and trees, that trees store above ground carbon in their trunks for hundreds of years.
Yes.
And that wood is used for long-term purposes like construction.
Yes.
Someone asked then, can you talk more about forest versus grassland storing carbon differently?
A bit more, but then you're going to reach the edge of my jack of all trades knowledge. So where to start? So if you think about the two systems, just like you mentioned, the forest system is storing carbon and it's storing it above ground. And then the senescence that's happening, the leaves falling, the trees eventually falling and decaying, that's happening at the upper, into the upper soil profiles. Now the roots are permeating deep, yes. But a lot of that carbon input is happening at the soil surface and then eventually permeating a bit further into the soil profile. The grassland system is going to be putting a lot more of its carbon down deeper into the soil. And sorry, I lost my train of thought there. It's going to be putting its soil deeper in, its roots down deeper into the soil theoretically, where there may be a higher clay content, maybe fostering more of the protected carbon. Now I'm thinking out loud here, so I don't want to go too far down that train. But if there's a more specific question you have about talking about these two different types, then I can try to answer that for you.
We do have another question. How does the benefit from the decomposition of dying roots compare to the carbon gains of maturing plant roots?
Sorry, let me ask again. How does the carbon benefit of roots dying in the soil profile
and decomposing compared to maturing plant roots?
So if it's a maturing plant root, it's still attached to the plant, you could say. So when it's attached to the plant, it's serving as a conduit. It's like the placenta from the plant to the soil. So the root that's alive is feeding that soil microbial activity that then is going to break down the root once it dies and turn it into organic matter. So they're kind of working with one another in tandem.
Michael Snow, who asked the question about the life cycle analysis, he also added something about, would we want to include something like biodiversity, such as Audubon's bird-friendly label, for example?
Yes, so if the question is in the life cycle assessment, the answer is yes. And actually, I'm working with a graduate student now where we are trying to come up with a way to actually incorporate biodiversity into LCA. There is a method that the FAO put out for how to do it, but to our knowledge, no one has actually published on it and tried to do it for a farm. So we took their guidelines and tried to create something that could be done in collaboration with ecologists and more easily available data. And she's actually about to defend her dissertation in like a month, I think it is. So we have a way, we'll have her way of doing this that I don't know if we'll be able to incorporate it this year in the analysis, but next year we may be able to incorporate it along with the carbon. And we do carbon, water, and energy assessment. So not just carbon unless that's all that you are interested in.
So, Jasmine, so many people in the chat are thanking you for sharing your knowledge in
Oh,
a digestible and thorough manner. Someone said this is one of the best presentations they've ever seen.
thanks,
And
y'all.
so while we were on this, I
Thank you.
uploaded Jasmine's slides to the files section of the landing page. You can find her slides there and download them for yourself. This presentation will also be on the website and on YouTube. I'm also saving the chat, so you can access this. Alice, go to the files tab on the session landing page to find those. So everyone loves it, Jasmine. And I
Thanks.
just want to thank both Jasmine and Dave for having this conversation for others to share in on. And then I want to remind all of you that right now we have a break until 6 o'clock. And during that break, we'd love for you to visit the virtual trade show. If you haven't already, please support our sponsors and chat with them. You can look at recordings of all the other sessions that's happened so far that you weren't able to attend. You can chat with other attendees. We have some like specialized meetings coming up during this period. And then at 6, we have our virtual potluck. And at 7, we start our keynote with Sarah Smarsh. So we'll see you back here later tonight. And thank you so much again for all of you attending.
Thank you all. And thanks for the opportunity, Megan. And thanks for the
Absolutely,
questions, Dave.
Jasmine.